I have a story to share with you, one that I've been too afraid to share with anyone until now. I wrote it over 2 years ago with the intention of including it in my video about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE study, because I thought that sharing my own ACE story might be a helpful way to bring all of that data to life. But in the end, I just couldn't overcome the shame that I feel about the things that have happened to me and how it's affected me, so I left it out. I gave in to that quiet but powerful voice that's always told me that if people knew the truth about me, they would never love or accept me.
We don't want weeds in our bed.
Even as I'm recording this, that voice of shame is telling me those things. But now, I think I'm ready to put it to the test. The following is my ACE story exactly as I wrote it over 2 years ago. Now, I'm not a writer or storyteller by any means, so please keep that in mind. This isn't an easy story to tell or to hear, but it's the truth. And it's one that's shared by countless others. Possibly even you. I hope that sharing my story helps you in some way, either to know that you're not alone or to gain a better understanding of the cascading effects of childhood trauma. For those of you willing to bear witness to it, I cannot thank you enough. I can't speak my truth or stand up to my own fear and shame without you. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. As always, I will do my best to talk about some very triggering subject matter in a way that's mindful and hopefully allows victims and survivors to still be able to listen to it and participate in the conversation. That being said, I do want to warn you guys that I will be touching on, but not going into graphic detail about, things like domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse, eating disorders, self-harm, suicidal ideation, substance dependence, mental illness, and probably a few others that I'm forgetting, honestly. For more information and resources about adverse childhood experiences, as well as some other things that I've found particularly helpful in my healing journey, please see the links in the description of this video. Do you believe in fate? That our lives are predetermined sequences of events beyond our control? That perhaps God has a plan for us, does things according to His will, and decides how and when we die? Or do you believe more in free will, that we determine the course of our lives through our own desires, decisions, and actions? Growing up, I didn't believe in things like fate or destiny. I was a precocious little girl who loved Paula Abdul, going on long walks in the forest with my papa, and playing outside with the neighborhood kids. As far as I was concerned, nothing was impossible for me, including my dreams of becoming an actress, astronaut, paleontologist. From all outward appearances, I was just a smart, well-behaved kid who was full of potential. There was nothing to indicate that I was hiding a terrible secret, the kind we're all taught as children that nice people don't talk about. Like countless other unassuming homes, what went on behind closed doors was the stuff of nightmares. Domestic violence, sexual abuse, and all-consuming terror were just as much a part of my home and family as the people in it. Because I couldn't fight or flee from the monster in my home, my brain learned early on to do some pretty clever things to survive. I would escape into the safe imaginary worlds I'd created in my mind. Places where magic was real, good always triumphed over evil, and bad things didn't happen to people who stayed on a righteous path. A lot of the time, that was enough to tune out what was happening to or around me, but sometimes it wasn't. Luckily for me, my vivid imagination was only my first line of defense. For the really bad things, I had a secret weapon, a superpower of sorts, that made it so that I could carry on in the wake of those traumatic experiences as though they hadn't happened. This meant I could get up and go to school as though nothing was wrong, and without the conscious awareness of what had happened the night before. I never questioned how or why I could do it, and I assumed I'd be able to do it forever. I thought my superpower was just my resilience, and that whether or not those terrible things affected me was a matter of choice, my choice. I genuinely believed that as long as I worked hard and made good choices and didn't dwell on the past, that one day I'd be okay. One day, either enough time will have passed or I will have built up my life in such a way to where none of it mattered anymore. I wasn't going to allow my childhood or that monster to have any bearing over what the rest of my life would be like. I alone determined my fate through my own free will. What I didn't know back then, and wouldn't fully understand until decades later, is that fate, or something like it, is very real. And by and large, my childhood had already sealed mine. And there were already signs of it. When I was 8 years old, my mom, my brother, and I managed to finally escape our abuser. Even though we moved to a different town, it didn't take him long at all to find us and shatter the illusion of safety we'd had. I was terrified of him every second of every day and night, and the constant threat to our lives made me hypervigilant in a new way. At least when we lived with him, we knew when he was around, when to be scared. But now he was lurking around outside at all hours of the day and night. We learned to live and move quietly in our little apartment just in case he was out there, because sometimes he was, and that was a very dangerous situation. He was everywhere, even when he wasn't, and nowhere felt safe to me, ever. At that time, I was in the 3rd grade, and despite the life-threatening crisis I was in, I still went to school every day and was held to the same standards as the kids who weren't constantly fearing for their lives and the lives of their family. When our brain is in that survival, fight or flight state, less critical things like learning and memory pretty much go right out the window. I honestly can't say how much this affected my school performance because I have no memory of being in the 3rd grade. Don't get me wrong, I remember kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, and 4th grade, but 3rd grade's just a big old blank spot. There are a lot of large gaps in my memory, even in adulthood. When I was 9, my mom started seeing someone new, and eventually we moved in with him. I changed schools again, and overall, things were objectively better, but I wasn't. I was struggling a lot in school, academically and socially, despite having always excelled at both rather effortlessly. Instead of being happy and creative and adventurous, I had horrible anxiety all the time. Back then, I didn't know what it was or even have the language to communicate what I was experiencing. So when asked, I would just say that I felt sick or had a stomach ache. Well, these stomach aches resulted in frequent trips to the nurse's office and absences from school, claiming that I felt sick, but having no other symptoms to support that. Needless to say, this behavior didn't go over well. I was accused of being a liar and an attention seeker. Eventually, I learned to not do anything at all when I felt sick like that because my body lies and so do I, and my feelings and perceptions can't be trusted. Having no explanation for why I felt sick and scared all the time made me feel like there was something deeply wrong with me, and I blamed and hated myself for it. So much so that I didn't want to be alive anymore. At that age, I'm pretty sure I didn't know that taking my own life was even an option, but I've found poems and drawings that I made from that period of time that clearly indicated both my desire to harm myself and not be alive anymore. By age 12, I had a full-fledged eating disorder, and by 15, my suicidal ideation turned into a plan. The only thing that stopped me from going through with it was the guilt I felt at the thought of my mom finding me in the gruesome aftermath. It really seemed like the only way to end the tremendous amount of pain I was in. That is until one day I accidentally cut my hand cleaning up a broken coffee mug, and Let's just say that led to a brief practice of that particular kind of self-harm. I was now a freshman in high school, and my grades were so abysmal that I had to transfer to an alternative high school for my sophomore year, which I actually did really well at. And in hindsight, I wish I would have just stayed there, but I wanted to be with my friends, so I transferred back to my original high school for my junior year. Unfortunately, my performance didn't transfer with me. It wasn't that I didn't care about school, quite the opposite, in fact. I wanted to go to college, and I knew that having good grades was kind of an essential part of that. I didn't want to fail, but nothing I did to try and improve things worked. For the life of me, I could not pay attention or retain any of what we went over in class. And more often than not, I would completely forget that I had homework, resulting in lots, and I mean lots, of missing and late assignments, and hence my terrible grades. It was also around this time that my brother was diagnosed with a pretty serious medical condition that really took up all of my mom's attention. So, through no fault of anyone, I was pretty much on my own. Eventually, I started skipping classes to sit alone in my friend's car. Now, I wasn't doing anything bad. I wasn't. I don't know, I just wanted to be alone and quiet. By that point, I had already been so disconnected from my body and internal state for years. But looking back, I think I was just feeling so overwhelmed all the time, but not really knowing it or knowing why. When I was 17, I started smoking. I entered the first of many unhealthy romantic relationships and became sexually active. My poor grades and habit of skipping classes nearly prevented me from graduating, but thankfully I was able to convince the attendance board to just let me graduate anyway. I was not headed off to college with my friends and peers, but I didn't give up on my dream. I resolved to work and go to junior college until I could get my GPA up and apply to universities. Those first couple of years out of high school were rough, to say the least. I was in an incredibly abusive relationship that, shocker, resembled the one that I grew up witnessing. And that was the first time I can recall experiencing some of the more well-known symptoms of PTSD, like flashbacks. But of course, I didn't know I had PTSD and never sought out any kind of treatment for it. A few months after that relationship ended, I met a guy who I thought was just way out of my league and was extremely flattered that he was interested in me, of all people. You know, terrible, repulsive me that's undeserving of love. Well, that image I had of myself was only reinforced when one night he lured me to his home under false pretenses. He said there was going to be a party at his house. There wasn't. And he drugged and raped me. Yeah, real piece of shit. He's dead now, so there's nothing I can do about it. But yeah. That really did a number on me. I felt disgusting and ashamed. And like, I don't know if I felt so much that I deserved it, but I felt like, well, of course this happened to you. This is what people do to you. Anyway, I didn't tell anyone. I just kept going on like nothing had happened. For the most part. I think my age, I was 19, sort of masked that I had or was developing a serious drinking problem, because at that age, my peers and friends were all drinking and partying as much as I was. Nevertheless, I didn't lose focus on my dream of going to college, and although it took me 4 years, I managed to pull it off. The day that I got that acceptance letter in the mail was the best day of my life up to that point. It meant so much more to me than simply going off to university. This was my ticket out of the life I desperately wanted to leave behind and into the world where the normal happy people lived, full of possibilities and opportunities, and where the nightmares of my childhood didn't happen. The day had finally come for me to ride off into the sunset and into the future I'd always dreamed of. I was going to be okay after all. Unfortunately, that isn't what happened. I was aware of the heightened risk of sexual assault on college campuses, but I didn't know that I was at a much higher risk of it and didn't think that it would happen to me. Well, within 2 months of being there, it did. I felt like all of the horrible things from my childhood had somehow reached through time and space and found me there, all those years later and on the other side of the state, to drag me back into the abyss. A reality that I couldn't psychologically bear. So I did the same thing I always did. Didn't tell anyone and continued on like it hadn't happened. Sorta. After that assault, some weird things had started to happen, like missing large chunks of time without any awareness of what I had done, not to mention doing things that were very out of character for me. But what disturbed me the most was that I had begun to sense that there was someone else living inside of me. Someone who was incredibly angry and just waiting for anyone to give them any reason to lash out. This other person didn't feel like me. It felt like walking around 24/7 with a very hostile and unpredictable person walking right beside me. And for some reason, I knew that if they really wanted to take over my body, they could do it. In fact, I was so afraid that I wasn't going to be able to control this other person living inside of me that I went to a counselor about it. Although I don't remember anything from those sessions and had actually forgot that I ever went to therapy until just a few years ago. Story for another day. With all of this going on, I felt whatever shred of sanity I had left coming apart, and I was barely hanging on. But I had to finish school. Without a degree, the doors to everything I've ever wanted in life would be closed forever. If I didn't graduate, my life, the hopes and dreams and safety I desperately needed, would be over. This was my only way out and only way forward. When I had to drop out a year later and move back home, it felt like the final nail in my coffin. To say I was devastated is putting it mildly. I lost all sense of direction and hope for my life and future, and came dangerously close to taking my own life again. Something in me just broke, and I could no longer see my future. Before, I would envision what I wanted and all of the paths and ways to get there. 1-year plans, 5-year plans, 10-year plans. But now, there was nothing. Life was now about short-term survival and not long-term planning and goals. And I lived accordingly. I was well into adulthood now, but the safety and freedom I'd always thought I'd find remained elusive. In fact, my adult life mirrored my childhood in many ways. Abusive relationships, mental illness, substance abuse, housing instability, and repeated sexual assaults were the mainstays of my 20s. Throughout my 20s, I was on this constant up and down roller coaster of getting my life on track and then having it all come crashing down and rebuilding again and crashing down again and so on and so forth. As the years went on, the periods of time where I was okay or functional, so to speak, were getting shorter. And the periods of time where I wasn't okay were getting longer and harder for me to claw my way out of each time. Despite all of my trying and everything I once had going for me, somehow I'd gone from a resilient little girl with so much promise to an alcoholic with dwindling options and mental health issues that were increasingly difficult to manage. Nevertheless, I didn't give up on myself or on the belief that one day things would get better, that I was capable of changing the circumstances I was in as long as I didn't give up. I just needed to move beyond struggling to survive. By my 30th birthday in 2017, I was doing the best I'd done in years. I had a good job. I was actually in a healthy relationship. I wasn't struggling so much with depression, and I had friends and hobbies, and I really thought my worst days were behind me. Now that was all well and good, but I should add, I was still an alcoholic who was self-medicating in the evenings and on the weekends, because regardless of my improved circumstances, my anxiety was always at intolerable levels for me and those around me, so I was still struggling with that. When the opportunity came for my partner Scott and I to move into a house in a nice part of town, we jumped on it. I already had everything I could ask for, so this was like the cherry on top. As I'm sure you all know, the cost of housing is ridiculous, and it certainly was where we lived, even back in 2017. So the only way that moving into this house was possible was that we would have roommates. There was already another couple living there, as well as one of their co-workers, who we'll call Josh. Not his real name. When we moved in, I remember feeling overwhelming gratitude and thanking God for answering my prayers. I felt like I had been saved from the brink of oblivion and guided toward the life I'd always wanted. Sure, it didn't look like what I thought it would. I was not a famous actress, astronaut, paleontologist, but that didn't matter to me. What mattered to me was that I was happy, that there were no more bad things or people to fear, no more traumatic events to blindside me and send me spiraling. I felt truly blessed and free to begin a new chapter of my life. The good part. The part that had always stayed just out of reach until now. Sometimes I'll look back on that time and try to find any clues as to what was about to happen. Any red flags, hints, or warnings that this new beginning was really the beginning of the end. The end of life as I knew it, of all my hopes and dreams for the future, and of all the elements of my life that I cherished and felt so grateful to finally have. And I never saw it coming. None of us did. A few weeks after moving in, we finally had the opportunity to hang out and have some drinks with our roommates. Scott had to work the next morning, so he called it quits a bit earlier than we did, but I stayed up for a while and continued hanging out and drinking with our roommates. They were awesome. It seemed almost too good to be true that we all got along so well. When the time came for us to call it a night, I headed toward my bedroom and saw that Josh had laid down on the living room floor. Assuming he did not want to pass out on the floor that night, I went over to him to wake him up and coax him toward his room, which was at the opposite end of the hallway from Scott and I's room. Kneeling beside him, I pushed on his arm to wake him, and that was it. The next thing I remember is hearing the sound of my bedroom door opening, Scott's footsteps coming down the hallway. Darkness, chaos, yelling. I had no context for what was happening. All that I was in that moment was passive awareness, disconnected from everything. I wasn't even aware of my body, laying tightly balled up and half naked on the floor. I don't know how long it took me to get up off the floor or how I got to my bedroom, but I remember laying in bed with an all too familiar sick feeling that something horrible had happened, only I couldn't remember it. I just knew it was one of the bad things. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. It had been so long since the last time. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And why does it keep happening to me? The answers to those questions were in a world that I didn't want to step into. One that required acknowledging that something had happened in the first place. I wasn't prepared to do that. I couldn't afford to do that. Not dwelling on the past had always been critical to my survival. And I knew that taking a moment to reflect and answer those questions would be the end of me. Lying there in the dark, heart pounding, I kept telling myself that I had nothing to fear. This was exactly what my superpower was for. All I had to do was go to sleep and things would be fine in the morning. As long as I didn't think about it or talk about it, things would go back to the way they were before, minus Josh living there. But I would be okay, because doing anything other than just moving on was impossible. Until it wasn't. The moment I opened my eyes the next morning, I knew something was very, very wrong. I felt just as raw, distraught, and wounded as I had the night before. The unthinkable had happened. My superpower hadn't worked. Never in all my years did it occur to me that that was even a possibility. And I had no clue what was wrong or how to fix it. Not knowing what else to do, I told myself that maybe my superpower was just a little delayed. It had been quite a while since we'd needed it. Maybe I just needed to give it a few days and things would be fine. Time heals all wounds, right? But the days turned into weeks and then into months, and there was no sign of my superpower. Not only was I not getting better, I was getting worse. New symptoms emerged that I didn't have the language for. I felt like a time traveler, aimlessly drifting somewhere between my past and present, unable to fully connect to one or the other. The world didn't feel real to me anymore. I didn't feel real to me anymore. Innocuous sights and sounds of daily life would send me careening through time and space before I even knew what hit me. I was missing time again, something I hadn't experienced since the rape in college. But that wasn't all. Once again, I could sense the very angry person living inside of me. Only now they weren't alone. I was aware of at least 4 other very distinct people living inside of me. I could hear them talking in my head, sometimes to me, sometimes to each other, sometimes just commenting on things that were going on. I can't overstate just how terrified I was. And I didn't know what to do. I thought I was possessed, but praying to God seemed futile since God had allowed all of this to happen in the first place. And if God wasn't watching over me or protecting me, or worse, if this was all part of His plan, what was going to happen to me? As time went on, all of the parts of my life that I cherished disappeared. I could barely leave my bedroom, let alone my house. Naturally, that meant I stopped going out and seeing friends and doing any of the hobbies that I'd picked up in recent years. I tried to do the things that I once enjoyed, but felt nothing. And I lost my job. Thankfully, Scott's income was enough to support the both of us. Otherwise, I would have ended up homeless. And I'd probably be dead now, honestly. This was my worst nightmare. I had just built a life that I wanted, that was fulfilling and I felt happy and safe in. And now, at the most critical moment, I could not get my shit together to keep any of it. I had no clue where my superpower was or if it was ever coming back at this point. I was backsliding into the abyss and I couldn't wait for it anymore. If I didn't figure out what was wrong with me and fix it fast, I would lose everything for good. Or worse. After a handful of recommended books and YouTube videos about trauma failed to yield the results I was after, I started to consider that maybe there was a medical cause for my issues. It had been a few years since I'd been on antidepressants, so I got back on those. After about 6 or 7 months of trying different ones without any success, I was getting pretty desperate. Not surprisingly, my doctor recommended that I go to therapy, which I had no interest in and truly did not think I needed it. I had tried it a number of times in the past, and it was always very destabilizing for me, which, let's face it, was the last thing I needed at that point. Not only that, but therapy takes time, which I was out of. At this point, it had been about a year since the assault, and I had made zero progress. As far as I was concerned, I'd exhausted all possible options. Giving it time didn't work. Self-medicating with alcohol didn't work. Medications didn't work. Meditation didn't work. Really, the only thing left to try was therapy, but I didn't see it as a viable option. Everything changed the day that I came across the Dissociative Experiences Scale, or DES. The DES is a screening tool for dissociative disorders that describes a number of ways dissociation manifests in people with those disorders. I will never forget how it felt reading through the DES that first time.
We have just lost cabin pressure.
It was all there. Things that I've experienced since childhood that I didn't know weren't normal, as well as a lot of the new weird things I was experiencing. Things that I could never explain or have the words for. Some of them even had names, like dissociation, depersonalization, and derealization. And I remember thinking, out of all the mental health professionals I'd seen over the years, how did none of them pick up on this? Why hadn't I heard of dissociative disorders before? Well, it turns out some of them had picked up on it, and I had heard of dissociative disorders before, but just conveniently forgot. Based on my DES score, I made an appointment with a local therapist who specializes in dissociative disorders to, 1, find out if that's what's been going on with me, and 2, to find out how to quickly fix things and get back on track. To my surprise and delight, that first therapy appointment didn't destabilize me any more than I already was. So I went the following week, and the week after that, and I just kept going week after week. By the time he officially diagnosed me with dissociative identity disorder, like 6 or so months later, it wasn't a shock or surprise to me at all. In fact, it was the first time my life and the things that I've experienced actually made sense. What did surprise me was that, as bizarre as my whole experience had been, I was certain that no one else had ever experienced anything like this ever. Turns out, my experience was all a pretty textbook progression of the disorder. Yeah, it was very weird feeling like a completely normal person, in the context of this very strange, fascinating, and grossly misunderstood disorder. So yeah, I was a pretty typical case. Typically, it's diagnosed in women in their early 30s, which I was. And typically, that person has absolutely no idea that they have DID until something happens and suddenly their whole system and ways of managing trauma, aka my superpower, stops working. And then their whole lives come falling down. Sound familiar? So this was all good news to me. Now that I had an accurate diagnosis and the right therapist, I had hope that I could get better. However, it wasn't all rainbows and roses. There still were some things about that diagnosis that were extremely difficult for me to come to terms with. Like the fact that I have this disorder as a direct result of the trauma and abuse I suffered in childhood. And in turn, it fundamentally altered my brain in ways that cannot be undone. There's also no quick fix or cure for it. The only treatment is years and years, possibly a lifetime of therapy. There would be no going back to the way things were before the assault. This was my life now. And the only way for me to have a normal life was to do the one thing I thought I could never do: process and heal from all of that trauma. As difficult as all that was to accept, it actually paled in comparison to what came next. Like I said before, I'd always believed that whether or not and to what degree the monster in my childhood impacted my life was 100% my choice. And I was determined to not allow him or the things that happened back then to have any bearing on what the rest of my life would be like. And I really thought I was doing that. That is until I learned about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are exactly what the name implies: adverse and traumatic experiences in childhood.
Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence.
The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE study, is the largest study ever conducted to examine the medical, social, and economic impacts of ACEs over the course of a lifetime. Or, in other words, how a messed up childhood messes up the rest of your life. This study has been replicated countless times all over the world with pretty consistent results. But in the initial ACE study, and essentially all subsequent ACE studies with mild variations, they took the 10 most commonly reported types of ACEs and put them in a yes or no questionnaire. For every yes answer, you got 1 point towards your ACE score. What they found was striking. First of all, ACEs are incredibly common, with roughly 2/3 of all people having at least one. And it should be noted that this is true across all races, geographic regions, and economic classes, with the only difference being a higher prevalence amongst those living in poverty. Second, they found that ACEs are essentially the number one public health crisis hiding in plain sight. For example, they found that an ACE score of 4, any 4 out of the 10, doesn't matter which ones, dramatically increases your risk of developing 7 of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States and worldwide. Compared to someone with an ACE score of 0, having an ACE score of 4 makes you twice as likely to develop heart disease, 2.5 times as likely to develop COPD, 4 times as likely to be depressed, and 12 times more likely to take your own life. And the risk only goes up with each additional point in your ACE score. So much so, in fact, that for the camp that I'm in, those with an ACE score of 6 or more, we are 46 times more likely to take our own lives and have a shortened life expectancy by 20 years. Yeah, let that sink in. When I first heard this, panic set in, then denial, and I thought, okay, maybe this doesn't apply to me. Like, for instance, the negative health consequences could easily just be the result of engaging in high-risk behavior, which I don't do. So I'm fine, right?
But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging.
Despite knowing all this, I still thought, I'm in pretty good health. Maybe I'm an outlier, somehow immune to the predictable outcomes based on my ACE score. So then I took a look at some of the social and economic outcomes of ACEs. reduced educational and occupational achievement, decreased productivity and performance, increased under and unemployment, low and minimum wage jobs, housing instability, including homelessness, mental illness, substance abuse, suicide attempts, difficulty forming healthy relationships, intimate partner violence, re-victimization, just to name a few.
Oh, fudge.
Only I didn't say fudge.
Going down this list, I can check off every single one. Oh, hi. This has been going on for years. And not only did I not know that these things were connected, but that they weren't unforeseeable at all. They were predictable. Predictable based on my childhood. Suddenly, that belief I'd held on to, that the monster and my childhood weren't going to determine the course of my life, shattered. I can't overstate just how devastating and terrifying that realization was for me, especially considering that the predictable outcomes go all the way up to the age and manner in which I'm likely to die. And I couldn't help but wonder, when did the predictable outcomes start manifesting in my life? Because the ACE study focuses on outcomes in adulthood, but did it start earlier than that? So then I looked at some of the ways trauma manifests in children. Preschool, separation anxiety, cry or scream a lot, eat poorly or lose weight, having nightmares. Elementary, anxiety, fear, guilt, shame, sadness, somatic complaints, headaches, stomach aches, difficulty regulating emotions, sleep disturbances, nightmares, behavioral issues, problems with memory, attention, concentration, thinking, and learning, decline in school performance. Middle and high school, feeling depressed or alone, loss of interest in normal activities, social withdrawal, poor self-image, eating disorders, develop self-harm behaviors, abusing alcohol or drugs, tobacco use, early initiation of sexual behavior, unintended pregnancy or paternity, difficulty regulating emotions, poor decision-making and impulse control, self-destructive behavior and aggression, involvement with gangs, crime, and juvenile justice systems, school suspension, expulsion, dropout, tardiness, and absenteeism. Needless to say, all of this information sent me into a bit of an existential tailspin. Probably more like nosedive. I might not believe in fate, but even I had to admit that my free will had been no match for whatever this is. At no point did I decide, you know what, forget realizing any of the goals and dreams that I have. Instead, I want my life to be just a series of predictable outcomes based on my childhood, and have the consequences of that childhood become so severe that I'm disabled at 31 and will die 20 years sooner than I should. I didn't want that. I never wanted that. I worked hard. I made good choices. I didn't dwell on the past. And yet, it all happened anyway. I couldn't escape it. And if that's the case, what can I realistically hope for going forward? Does it even matter what I want or strive for? Was there any point in going to therapy and trying to regain a normal life? Or would the rest of my life be just as predictable as it had been so far? The CDC has this handy little ACEs pyramid showing the progression of things, and there I was at the time of writing this, age 34, and I was already right near the top. According to the pyramid, the only thing left for me is early death. Fate is defined as the development of events beyond a person's control, regarded as determined by a supernatural power. But what if we replaced supernatural power with something real that's supported by decades of research? Something like adverse childhood experiences. And for clarity, let's swap out events for predictable outcomes so that it reads, Fate, the development of predictable outcomes beyond a person's control, regarded as determined by adverse childhood experiences. I mean, I know we've drastically changed the definition there, but that definition of fate kind of checks out. Compared to free will, The freedom to make choices that are not determined by prior causes, divine intervention, or fate, or adverse childhood experiences. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, Heather, plenty of people have had rough childhoods, and they go on to achieve great things and live enviable lives. You're just stuck in this victim mentality and making up excuses for your own failed life. Okay, let's roll with that. I don't believe that I'm a perpetual victim of circumstances beyond my control and therefore not responsible for my actions or choices. I can readily admit that I have made all kinds of bad decisions throughout my life, some of which even resulted in significant, long-lasting consequences for me. All I'm asking you to consider is this: would I have made the same choices and had the same challenges if my ACE score was 0? After seeing the data and the very predictable path my life has taken, I think it's safe to say that the answer is no. My life would have unfolded very differently if my ACE score was 0. The thought that the monster had determined my fate and that my free will may be no match for it, the knowledge that I'm forced to pay for his crimes with my life, was honestly too much for me to bear. I started to think that maybe the only way to truly be free of him and my fate, to put an end to the seemingly endless and pointless suffering, was to not live it at all. To take my own life. And I'll be honest, for a few moments, that sounded like a really great idea. A liberating one, even. But then I remembered that out of all the predictable outcomes for me based on my ACE score, the most likely outcome, the one that blows all the rest out of the water, is that I will take my own life. Well, shit. Taking my own life wouldn't be this final grand act of defiance. It'd be playing into the very fate I wanted to escape, the one he set in motion for me. But if I can't die, that means I have to live. And I was left to answer a difficult question, one that I hadn't considered before. How do I live with this? How can I live in such a way to where my life feels like my own, even if all of the other predictable outcomes come to pass? I really struggled to answer that, and the more time that passed, the more I feared I didn't have one. Eventually, I came across a TED Talk by author and self-proclaimed student of adversity, Andrew Solomon, called How the Worst Moments of Our Lives Make Us Who We Are. And in it, he talks about wanting to understand why some people, when faced with great challenges, seem to draw strength from them. It's a phenomenal talk with so many invaluable little tidbits of wisdom, but I credit these bits in particular with changing my life.
We don't seek the painful experiences that hew our identities, but we seek our identities in the wake of painful experiences. We cannot bear a pointless torment, but we can endure great pain if we believe that it's purposeful. After you've forged meaning, you need to incorporate that meaning into a new identity. You need to take the traumas and make them part of who you've come to be, and you need to fold the worst events of your life into a narrative of triumph, evincing a better self in response to things that hurt.
This completely changed how I saw everything. I can't change the past, nor can I fully control what happens to me in the future, but I can ultimately decide what it all means to me and my life. The question for me was no longer, how do I live with this? But rather, what do I want it to mean to me? And how might I give it purpose? As I contemplated those questions, I had what I can only describe as the closest thing I've ever had to a conversation with God or some higher power. It's a little embarrassing, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. In my mind's eye, a nondescript image of God appeared and asked me a very ungodly question. What can I do to make this up to you? What sort of outcome would make you feel like all of the pain and suffering was worth it? And without any conscious thought, my answer popped up immediately. For what happened to me to never happen to any child ever again. For children to not have to suffer the lifelong consequences of ACEs. A tall order, I know. Arguably impossible. But maybe I didn't have to end all childhood trauma to accomplish that. The outcomes of ACEs are predictable, and therefore preventable. There's already research and efforts underway to implement positive childhood experiences that actually counteract the negative effects of toxic stress in kids, so that even if we can't prevent the ACEs, we can prevent them from impacting those kids for the rest of their lives. And that is wonderful. But I still didn't see how that connected to me or what role I could play in that. I found the answer I was looking for in a lecture by the father of the ACE study, Dr. Vincent Felitti. In it, he described ACEs as
experiences that are overwhelmingly unrecognized. They're kept as family secrets. We're all taught as children that nice people don't talk about certain things. And then it's further protected by shame and by secrecy and by social taboos against exploring certain realms of human experience.
That was it. That was my answer. I can talk about it, spread awareness, end the stigma, help others feel like they can talk about it, make ACEs exactly the kind of thing nice people talk about. And so I started a YouTube channel called Nice People, where I talk about anything and everything that's been shrouded in shame and stigma for far too long. ACEs, mental illness, trauma, heck, even UFOs more recently. It's one of the best things I've ever done. I've not only found purpose and meaning in it, but also community and connection, and freedom from the soul-crushing shame I have felt most of my life about the things that have happened to me. I know it might sound crazy, but I even feel grateful again for the way that things have turned out. Because if my life hadn't fallen apart back in 2017 and forced me to confront the things that I was running from, it is extremely likely that I would have spent the rest of my life desperately trying to stay one step ahead of the specter of my childhood and numbing out with alcohol and not even realize I was playing out a series of predictable outcomes, which isn't living. That's surviving. And I now feel more capable of living my life, a fulfilling life, than I ever have before. I've still got a long journey of healing ahead of me, and I'm sure there will be bumps along the way, including some predictable outcomes. But that's okay, because as far as I'm concerned, I've won.
Forging meaning and building identity does not make what was wrong right. It only makes what was wrong precious.